Hi, how are we? Yeah, great to be here. Design tokens. Show of hands, who's using them? Oh, fantastic. Supernova customers, great people. Um, we kind of have like three layers of design tokens within our systems. So you might think of like primitives, where we're just, you know, naming very basic things like your colors and your font scales. These can either be statically named, so you might say that all of my errors are red, all of my success states are green, I have a font size that goes from small to large, or we can dynamically generate those with some algorithms. We have contextual tokens, where you might have also heard of these as like semantics or decisions. These are the semantically named decisions that sort of codify those logical abstractions and define how we change things across the system. Those are kind of critical to you getting a solid token architecture that lets you build out multiple brands, multiple products, multiple platforms. And then, if you go on Twitter, or X as it is now, component tokens. Some people fight over them. Do we need them? Don't we need them? I say yes. If you work in multi-brand agencies, white label systems, yes, 100%. But these are like specific tokens that kind of define every part of a component, how it's rendered. Great for callback, designer-developer collaboration. And we name our design tokens, or our variables, if we're against using design tokens, to make finding them easier. So you end up with hundreds, possibly even thousands of design tokens in a system when you work on large enterprise scale things, or big multi-brand things. So how do we name our design tokens to make finding them easier when we reference them in each other? So primitive tokens are really easy. We should ask ourselves, what type of token is it? What word best describes it? And if it's a part of a series, where is it? So the token type, the descriptor, and then this optional point in the series. So it might be something like color gray 500. That sort of naming came from material, where we name colors as almost like font weights. You might use a descriptive word for like a border radius, which is a dimension token. We might say that's like fully rounded. Or we define a font and just say, this is the sans serif font we use. Component tokens, these get big and scary, which is why there's a lot of fighting over them on whether we should use them or not. But yeah, this kind of actually gets quite simple when you break it down. So we begin our token name with the set. So all of our component tokens live in a collection called components. We then categorize those to make them easier to find. So all of my buttons are actions, things like drop-downs and text fields are inputs, menus and navigation items. You'll think up your own sort of like information architecture there on how you categorize components. You then might have like subcategories if you've got lots of components and need to like nail those down even further. So things like actions and buttons, and then icon buttons would be in the subcategory of buttons. Name is very important. Every component needs a name. Keep it short, keep it succinct. Name what your component is. And then the important stuff is sort of optional here, but this is where your matrix of design tokens sort of scale out. When we think about variants, so we might have like size or layout direction for a card, our intention behind why we use that component. So I might have a neutral button, or a big shiny green positive button in my checkout flow, or a standard digital blue CTA, or these kind of things. The hierarchy, so you might have 3 levels of buttons to sort of show big scary buttons we want people to click versus sort of smaller, more minimal ones, like unsubscribe buttons. The state of that element and how we interact with it. So we define how a component changes between things like the initial state, hovering, pressed, focused, blah, 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 blah. Elements being those sub-elements if we've got bigger, complex components. So maybe the container of a drop-down versus the placeholder text. And then the attribute. The rule here that I follow is name these the same as the CSS attribute where possible. it just becomes a really easy method to follow. And most people know CSS. MDN documents it really well. So yeah, use things like background color, font size, padding, all the kind of words to name the end of your component token. But yeah, those do look kind of big and long and scary. Hot tip is to just consolidate the values you repeat, right? So all of my actions that are buttons that are small have the same padding. I don't need to define that padding multiple times for my positive button, my negative button, my brand button, et cetera, et cetera. So you only need to be specific when things do change. So, the padding would change between my small button and my medium button, and so I define those as different tokens. Naming contextual tokens is where it gets hard, right? Where we're making abstractions, we don't really, we have to find this shared language between everyone that understand what something means. This is where systems get stuck. Primaries and components, we can follow a templating system, but yeah, those semantic tokens are a little bit difficult. And again, we kind of have 3 levels of these contextual or semantic tokens. The simple stuff, where we're just assigning one value to another, a standard sort of alias. Again, it's errors are red, corners are round, titles are sans serif, for example. Then we have this idea of functional tokens, where we can use expressions and algorithms to define a token that responds to a certain input or output. So you might think of a fluid typography scale, or maybe line heights change with density across different modes. I can input a different number and get a different output. And those inputs can change between themes or variable modes. And then specific, or what we call granular semantics. These are where we're kind of trying to group those big decisions across generalizations of our components. So again, all actions are a certain size, or our controls are behave in certain ways, and we can define in there how a surface would change when you interact with it, how different hierarchies and intents are meant to be displayed. So simple ones, we categorize them by their purpose, and we organize them into groups depending on what changes. So we start the name of the token here. So the prefix here is scheme or density or typography. These are the equivalent of variable modes in Figma or sets in Token Studio, which syncs with Supernova. Shared bug. So yeah, we start it. So my color scheme changes, my density changes, or my typography changes, maybe from between something something's editorial and business facing. Dynamic tokens. These are tokens that are derived from functions of multiple references. So my dynamic padding might change based on a base padding value multiplied by a density scale. So our standard might be 100%. We might have then a tighter density at 95, or a looser at 110, which is kind of how you might have seen that in Google applications. And then things like dynamic font scales. Nate Baldwin did a really good talk not long ago about, I think, scalable scales at scale. But here you'll see that the number 6 is highlighted in purple, hopefully. So my dynamic font size is a function of a base font size, which is my 0 point in the scale, multiplied by a factor to the power of the point in that scale, multiplied by a viewport scale. So we can get really complex systems to build fluid and dynamic tokens. And then these granular tokens, we're setting rules for multiple components at once. So all of my controls that are medium size have a certain amount of padding. All of my selected navigational elements, between tabs and a menu bar and a flyout menu, they all take the brand key color in its strongest form. So those are kind of the 3 semantic token types. And what we're trying to do here is logically abstract the way that things change in our system. And token values can change, with every brand mode, between products, between viewports, scales, language. If we think about bringing in internationalization and maybe Asian characters, you might change how your entire interface scales, direction, platforms, densities, color schemes, which some people call like light and dark. I prefer the word scheme. Some people like mode or theme, but wording is hard. Nobody's using scheme for anything else at the moment, so I've stolen that one and put it in there. And then, maybe things like accessibility modes as well, like how we handle colorblind colors or fonts for dyslexia. And we toggle these sets to change how something looks. So I have a light scheme, a dark scheme, a high contrast scheme. I have a couple of brands in there. I have like Acme, Inc, and Megacorp. And I can change their density between high, medium, and low. These things can scale out depending on what your system needs. You might only have a single brand with a light and dark mode in a very, a standard sort of system, but then bigger agency needs or big, enterprises. You might have lots and lots of different collections of tokens. But yeah, you toggle things and change how the system looks. But names must stay the same across these modes. So if you've ever used variables in Figma, you know that they display them in a table. It makes sense because the token name is always the same, but the value changes with each column. So keep our names the same, we make them predictable. And yeah, so there's kind of like 4 steps, I think, to how we sort of name these semantic tokens. We start with a collection name, so this changes my color scheme. I know this is just so that I can find it. Like everything gets sorted alphabetically. I find everything that's set by scheme. That's in a big folder called scheme. I can find that easily. The next step is to group it based on your own sort of like information architecture. I highly recommend running card sorting exercise within your design systems team, understanding how you can categorize these things. So, this is the color that I use for my error states, and so it signals something to the user, hence I've called it a signal. We then describe the intention behind that token. In this case, this says something's gone wrong, so it's nice and negative. And then the 4th step is to make descriptive scales. If you've got a group of tokens that have scales, avoid numeric increments, because they make no sense. Something like, if you go back a slide, if I call this scheme signal -5, what does 5 mean in that scale versus a word like strong? That gives me the understanding that that's probably got more pigment, or it shows that it's more dominant on a page. So use scales of adjectives that make sense. So things like going from weakest to strongest, or smaller to larger, although some people hate t-shirt sizing, lower to higher, or maybe tighter to looser. If we think about adjectives that we have 2 ends of a spectrum. And so if we look at, I've pulled these from Radix colors, and they have a light and a dark mode, so that's the scheme that changes. And I've named these colors going from a weakest to strongest. You can see that in dark mode, my weakest is very dark, and in light mode, my weakest is very pale. If I named that scale lightest to darkest, that then makes no sense when it comes to dark mode. So we've got to come up with wording systems that work across our modes as well. And so this is the idea of logical abstractions. The other thing, and this is sort of me getting on a bit of a soapbox here, I hate the word primary. It's such a default word to use. Default is also a word that I hate. Yeah, it's far too ambiguous. If we look at, I've pulled these from Spectrum, I think, give them credit for the UI design. What one here is the primary button. So, we often use primary to define the intention of something, but also the hierarchy. So, we might call a brand color the primary brand color, but then we might have the most dominant call to action button on a page also be the primary button. We're mixing those metaphors, and therefore our language is getting confused. So when we're sort of defining our component tokens, the other thing is don't describe how something looks. So a common thing I see people do is name something like the buttons. It's a design system talk. We're talking about buttons. Sorry. It's things like solid, outline, and ghost. This might work if you're a single brand or a single product. When you work with agencies and multi-brand products, somebody's going to go, I don't want my buttons to be solid, I want them to be outlined. But you've defined that as like your main button. So it's then very hard to rework your system to make it so that all of their main buttons or their high priority buttons can be outlined instead of solid. So we describe how we use that component instead. So yeah, the best practice here is call, that's my high priority button, my medium priority button, and my low priority button. And then I can choose how they're rendered. So avoid using words that describe how something looks. The same way, you call your token error, you don't call it red, because you want to change that red. So yeah, a system here might be something like, we call like what would be by default like the primary color, the key color. It has an accent, and then we also have like a neutral variant to it. And then our hierarchy of buttons goes from high to low. And so we're not mixing our metaphors there. We can understand that when I'm applying that design choice and I'm building a form, what's the purpose behind the button I'm using? So maybe I want to communicate some branding in there, and I want to be like the most dominant button on the page, and so I use the high key button versus maybe it's like a simple cancel button, and that uses like a medium neutral. Yeah, no using the word primary. Delete it from your design systems. And so naming our contextual tokens is basically start off with the name of the thing that changes and just keep adding groups. Do card sorting and abstract things out that make sense and use words that make sense. So some examples here might be that I've got a set of UI like tokens, all my padding things, they're dynamic, and it's got a scale. I know I said use adjectives, padding, you can use numbers, I don't care. It's easier to code with. Surfaces, keys, dominant, hover. My brand, things might change in there. I've got an accents weak, actions, etc., etc. That's all I can talk about for tokens for now, because people want to get home. But yeah, Q&A, ask me things, reach out. I'm on the internet in places. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we can do a last round of Q&A. Why not? Yes, why not? You can be my co-host as well. Volunteers. Okay, yes. I'm going to pass the mic because I thought that was so thoughtful, and I'm going to give you another one.
Thank you. What would you say, how many tokens are too many tokens?
I get revenue on every token you make. No, no, it really. Try not to say it depends, because I'm a consultant, and that's just easy to get a jail free card. There's like 2 rules of thought with this. So you might have heard of what we call like dry or don't repeat yourself when we're trying to make abstractions. But then there's also the counterpoint to that is aha, or avoid hasty abstractions. And then there's a third one as well, which is called like wet, which I think is write everything twice. Basically, build enough layers so that you can control everything you need. There isn't like a set amount of how many tokens make sense. I've worked on systems with like 60 components. I've worked on systems with like 10 components. Obviously, they're going to have multiple numbers of tokens, depending on how many you've got. Component tokens, there's kind of like 2 ways of approaching that. You can either go down the route of like headless components, where so something like React Aria or Radix Unstyled or MUI, I think is another one. Basically, they provide you components where every single styling property is exposed, and then you can overwrite it. So it's called headless. It kind of comes from like CMS days where like something doesn't actually decide how it's rendered, but you have a token for every single design property of a component, and then you could go through every single variant. You've multiples, multiples, and multiples. It soon balloons. which is why we kind of need better tooling to like make these design decisions as well. But yeah, that's a long way of saying it depends, and yes, lots, but also not many. Make good abstractions, and you'll have fewer tokens. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, I have
Hi.
two questions. How would you onboard new designers into this complex system? And the second question, how would you start the discussion with developers regarding the naming conventions? Because they usually have their own, and they don't want to be, you know, said how is it called?
Yeah, yeah. Sean? Yeah, so I'll answer the second one first because I've got ADHD and I can't remember what the first question was. We'll come back to that. So naming conventions, when we look at those component tokens, those really define every single property of that component. The naming structure there is actually so solid that it's kind of hard to argue with, right? Because it's what it is, how it changes, and what like the attribute is. That the naming conventions there with component tokens, those are something that get set in stone and won't change over time. That to some degree, the naming convention doesn't matter because you hand over once and then you've almost created like what we call like a component API to define that component styling. That unless you're changing that component over time, anything you do stylistically, you do at the layers above that component token. So your component names don't change, and therefore, like the naming of that component doesn't matter as much because hand over once, build once, and then CI/CD pipelines. Use Style Dictionary, use Supernova. Plug. Those pipelines will just keep running and running. The naming conventions kind of become less necessary, but you kind of just have a templating system to set that up. If that sort of answers that question. And I forget which the first question was.
The first one is, how would you onboard new designers into the system?
Yeah, cool. Document. It's unavoidable. Documentation helps. Again, we're making abstractions there. So the real thing is document the rationale behind an abstraction. So with that kind of setup, you're defining what's changing, and therefore it's kind of obvious that something like a token that's name begins with density probably relates to density, right? That it makes sense what those categories are. That you're almost building a sitemap of your architecture. I guess there's two sides to onboarding as well, right? You've got onboarding designers that are in the system as design system maintainers, and then design system consumers. A lot of the time, consumers of design systems don't really need to be touching tokens at this point. Your components just sort of handle their own styling, and you've got all the variant switches you need to do what it needs to do. The only tokens I really expose at this point would be things like spacing, because that's the only thing we really need to allow designers to do still. So you'd have all your tokens that you sort of show your design system consumers at the very far end of the system, they're close to product. All they really need access to is spacing and the components themselves, and the components handle their own styling.
Okay, thank you.
Happy? Cool. Awesome. Oh, sorry. It's dark at the back.
Yeah, thanks. This presentation gave me a bit of a headache, but
It gave me one too.
I have a question. Let's imagine a scenario where I'm trying to convince a client, and I want to get his buy-in to adopt this, let's say, complex token-based system. What is the one most visible or tangible selling point of this token system compared to maybe some current solution that they have right now?
I guess it's always going to depend on client needs, right? And as a consultant, you've got to put the client first. It's very easy just to go, my system's amazing and it can do all these things for you, but if it doesn't actually solve their need, it's useless. I've worked on systems that adoption's failed because we've gone far too overboard and actually, it's not solved the core need of why that design system needs to exist in the first place. If they're a client that's working with things like multiple brands or multiple platforms, and they need this idea of co-locating all of their design decisions into one place and then letting them spread out, then these systems are worthwhile. Right? But if they're, if they just need a landing page, just make them a landing page. Like, they don't need a design system for that kind of thing. I think it's very easy for us to build design systems and get excited when we've got like a greenfield project. Because, you can do things for the future. But systems are expensive. Those kind of systems will take a couple of months at least to build up. The more people you add into that, the longer those things take as well. You don't necessarily need to sell this to somebody. This is more for, you're running an agency where you've got multiple clients that all feed off like a white label system, or you're an enterprise with a house of brands, or Volkswagen Group, decide they want to control every single brand under one system. It's those kind of things. That's where these systems really come into play. But you can take a lot of the stuff that I've shared here and take that back to like a simpler system as well. That, maybe the value there is I just need a light mode and a dark mode. All right, you just need to make those logical choices to make making dark mode easier. That's where those things are kind of helpful. You don't just do everything. You can build on top of it. Oh, sorry.
Thanks. That's a quick one. Just out of curiosity, do you have experience with integrating design tokens into Tailwind? If your front-end guys like Tailwind, the short inline styles, which are very shortcutty.
Yeah. All right, how do I say this nicely? Tailwind's great. I just don't like it. So another plug, sorry. My colleague Sam Gordashko, who was going to be here tonight, but unfortunately doesn't know when planes land, has built a Tailwind resource for Token Studio to sort of share these things and how they work. I can't give you a great answer because I looked at it and thought, no, never going to touch that in my life. I'm very opinionated about the tools I use. You can, I think, build out these logical abstractions again and like pair things back. I think Tailwind's probably really good for working with a couple of things, but when you need to start adding in a lot of business logic, I think that's where it breaks down personally for me. Also, I just find the code unreadable. But yeah.
Thanks.
No worries. I'll reach out to you and share your Sam's resource on Tailwind.